The coat was still warm. That was the part that undid her completely. Inez Townsend pressed her palm flat against the heavy wool of Charles Garrett's greatcoat, the one he'd worn every bitter winter since she'd known him, the one that smelled of pine smoke and leather and something indefinably, achingly him, and she felt the heat still radiating from the fabric like the ghost of a man who'd only just stepped out of the room. But he hadn't just stepped out. She knew that with a certainty that sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, heavy and final and spreading its weight outward until she couldn't breathe around it. No note. She'd looked. She'd overturned every surface in the small house, pulled open every drawer, lifted every corner of the rag rug by the stove, pressed her fingers between the pages of the Bible on the mantel. Nothing. Just the coat on the hook beside the door, hung there with a deliberateness that could only have been intentional, because Charles Garrett was not a careless man. He had never done a single thing in his life without intention. She knew what it meant. That was the worst of it, the part she could not outrun no matter how her mind tried to scramble towards some other explanation. She knew, the way women who have loved quietly and fiercely for long enough always know, that he had left it for her. Not because he'd forgotten it, not because the morning was mild enough to go without it, because where he was going he didn't expect to need it anymore, because he'd wanted her to have something warm. The realization broke over her in a wave so cold it was almost physical, and she sank onto the wooden chair by the table and stared at the coat until the room around it blurred into nothing, until the whole world narrowed down to that single hook, that single garment, that single terrible act of wordless love and finality and sacrifice. And she thought, no, not without a fight, not without her. But she was already a full day behind him. And in the New Mexico territory in the spring of 1882, a day was an eternity. To understand why a coat on a hook with no note could fracture a woman who had survived everything the frontier had thrown at her, you had to understand where Inez Townsend had come from, and you had to understand Charles Garrett, and you had to understand the peculiar and devastating way that two people who should have loved each other openly had instead loved each other in secret for the better part of 2 years, circling the truth of it the way horses circle a fire, drawn by the warmth and terrified of the burn. Inez had arrived in the town of Redemption, New Mexico territory, in the fall of 1880, by way of a stagecoach, a broken engagement in Missouri, and the stubborn conviction that a woman of 26 with no prospects and a considerable amount of practical skill had no business sitting in her mother's parlor feeling sorry for herself. She'd answered an advertisement placed by the Redemption Valley Land and Cattle Association, seeking a schoolteacher willing to serve the growing community forming along the banks of the Pecos tributary they called Sorrow Creek, which was, as she quickly discovered, an entirely accurate name for a waterway that flooded twice a year and ran dry in July. Redemption itself was the kind of town that had been named optimistically, and then proceeded to live up to the irony rather than the aspiration. It had a main street that turned to mud at the first suggestion of rain, a general store run by a meticulous German-born man named Heinrich Baum who kept the best organized inventory Inez had ever encountered, a saloon called the Red Lantern that did more business than everything else on the street combined, a sheriff's office that was perpetually understaffed, and a schoolhouse that had been built by community volunteers and showed it, the walls not quite plumb, the roof not quite level, but the whole thing solid enough and full of children who were hungry for something she could give them. She'd loved it immediately. That had surprised her. She'd expected to endure it. Charles Garrett she had not expected at all. He was the deputy sheriff when she arrived, a position he filled with a kind of quiet, unshakable competence that the town had organized itself around without quite realizing it. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair that he wore a little long for the fashion and gray eyes the color of a sky deciding whether to rain. He had a scar along his left jawline from an encounter he never discussed, and a habit of standing in doorways with his arms crossed, and his expression neutral that Inez's students called scary, and that Inez privately thought was the opposite of scary. It was the expression of a man who was watching very carefully and feeling considerably more than he intended to show. She had met him on her second day in redemption, when she'd gone to the sheriff's office to report that someone had been in the schoolhouse overnight, disturbed some of the supplies she'd been organizing, and left muddy boot prints across the floor she'd just swept. Sheriff Aldous Meade had been out on a call to the Perkins Ranch, and Charles had taken her report with a careful, unhurried attention that she had found simultaneously steadying and unnerving. He'd asked precise questions. He'd written down her answers in a neat, close hand in the official ledger. He had walked with her back to the schoolhouse and examined the boot prints and concluded, correctly as it turned out, that it had been two of the older Reed boys looking for somewhere to sleep off a bender without their father knowing, because their father knowing generally involved consequences they preferred to avoid. He had fixed the latch on the schoolhouse door himself that afternoon, without being asked. He hadn't mentioned it to her. She'd found the new latch and known it was him, the way you sometimes just know, and she hadn't mentioned it to him either, and perhaps that had been the beginning of everything, that first small language of unspoken understanding. They had talked after that, not frequently at first, and never about anything that might qualify as significant, at least not on the surface. They talked about the children she was teaching and the particular challenge of keeping the attention of a room that ranged in age from 6 to 14. They talked about the territory, which Charles had lived in for 8 years by then and knew in the intimate, comprehensive way of a man who had ridden most of its distances. They talked about books occasionally, because it turned out Charles Garrett read everything he could lay his hands on, a fact she'd discovered when she'd mentioned the novel she'd brought from Missouri, and he had not only recognized it but had opinions about it that were more nuanced than anything she'd encountered from the educated men in her prior life. They did not talk about the past. That was a territory they both avoided by unspoken mutual agreement. Two people who had arrived in redemption carrying damage they had each decided, independently, to carry quietly. What Inez knew of Charles's history she had assembled gradually from the sediment of small remarks and the comments of others who'd known him longer. He'd come to New Mexico from Texas, from somewhere in the hill country, where something had happened that had left him without the family he occasionally referenced obliquely, and with a flatness in his voice that meant old grief, the kind that has been lived with long enough to stop being sharp and become instead a steady, manageable ache. He'd been a ranch hand before he was a lawman. He was good with horses in the way that meant a communication beyond technique. He had never, as far as anyone in redemption could establish, been seriously involved with a woman, though several women in the town had demonstrated varying degrees of interest in correcting this situation, with a consistent lack of success. Inez had her own history, carried in the careful way she held herself, the particular tension across her shoulders when a man's voice rose in a room, the way she had of going very still and very quiet when a situation became uncertain, a stillness that looked like composure, and was actually the deeply practiced art of making yourself small and unnoticeable, learned during a childhood with a father who had been brilliant and charming, and adored by everyone who didn't live with him. She did not talk about these things. She had come to redemption partly to get far enough from their shadow that she could begin to take up the space she actually wanted to take up in the world. The school helped with that. The children helped with that. The simple, clarifying work of having a purpose that was entirely her own helped enormously. And Charles Garrett helped, though she had resisted acknowledging this for longer than was probably sensible, because it had seemed important to her to be sure that what she was feeling was not simply the old pattern dressed in new clothes, not simply the pull toward a man who was competent and contained, and therefore felt safe in the way that men who never lose their temper can feel safe, even when the real danger has nothing to do with temper. But Charles was different. She knew it not from what he said, but from what he did. He was different in the way he treated Heinrich Baum's wife, who was Apache and whom many of Redemption's residents treated with a cool politeness that did not disguise its contempt. With the same direct, uncomplicated respect he extended to everyone whose conduct he had no cause to question. He was different in the way he had once stepped between the town drunk and a young Mexican boy who'd done nothing more threatening than walk down the wrong side of the street, and said quietly, without any drama at all, that there was nothing happening here that needed his attention, and his tone had been so certain and so flat that the drunk had muttered something and walked away, and Charles had looked at the boy and said that he'd be happy to walk along with him for a bit if that suited. Because sometimes company made the street feel friendlier, the boy had said yes. Inez had witnessed this from the door of the general store and had felt something shift in the center of her chest with an almost audible sound. He was different in the way he talked to her. He didn't talk to her like a woman whose opinions were a pleasant novelty to be indulged. He talked to her like a person whose thinking he was genuinely interested in. He disagreed with her sometimes, directly and without apology, which she found she preferred enormously to the alternative. By the spring of 1881, 6 months after her arrival, she was in love with him. She knew this with the same certainty that she knew mathematics, not a feeling that required examination or defense, simply a fact. She was in love with Charles Garrett, and she was not going to tell him, because she was also certain that she had not yet become the version of herself that she could trust with a love like that she was still too newly free of old habits to be confident that she'd recognize the difference between love and the comfortable familiarity of a man who made her feel seen. She told herself she was being prudent. She told herself she was protecting herself. She was doing both of those things, but she was also, and she understood this even as she did it, protecting him from being loved by someone who wasn't yet whole, which was its own form of love and its own form of secret. What she didn't know, couldn't know, not yet, was that Charles Garrett was doing exactly the same thing, carrying the same certainty, exercising the same restraint, telling himself the same story about prudence and timing and the particular fragility of something precious being handled before it was quite ready. And behind all of that, behind the restraint and the prudence and the careful watching from doorways, he was carrying something else entirely, something he hadn't told anyone in Redemption. A dark past that had followed him across the territory like a shadow that moved independently of the sun, waiting for the angle to catch up. His name had been Garrett for 8 years. It had not always been his name. The trouble arrived in Redemption on the 14th of April, 1882, and it arrived in the shape of 2 men who rode in from the south on horses that had been pushed hard, and who took a room at the boarding house run by Widow Calloway, and then sat in the Red Lantern saloon all evening and drank less than they appeared to, and watched the street through the window with a focused, professional patience that told Inez, when she noticed them on her way home from the schoolhouse, that they were waiting for something. She mentioned them to Charles the next morning. He was at the livery stable when she found him, checking the shoe on his roan mare, and when she described the 2 men, his hand stilled on the horse's leg for just a moment. Just one moment, barely a flicker, and then he'd straightened and turned, and his face was the careful blank that she'd come to understand meant the opposite of nothing. He said quietly that he appreciated her telling him and that he'd keep an eye on them. She said that was not actually what she was asking about, and he looked at her with those gray eyes and something moved in them, something honest and complicated, and then he looked away. She asked him directly. She said, "Charles, do you know who those men are?" He said that there were men from his past that he had hoped to keep in his past, and that he was sorry to be bringing any trouble to Redemption, and that she should not worry. She said, with a directness that had taken her 2 years to earn in herself, that telling a woman who cares about someone not to worry is not information, it's dismissal, and she'd rather have information. He looked at her then with such a complicated expression, something layered and pained and grateful all at once, that it was all she could do to hold her ground and not close the space between them. He said he would tell her. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He said he owed her that much. They had walked to the creek while he talked, the same Sorrow Creek that flooded and dried up in turns, which was running quick and cold from the spring snowmelt. And he had told her in the careful, measured way of a man who has rehearsed saying something difficult that his family name was not Garrett. That 8 years ago he had been Charles Reardon, youngest son of a ranching family in the Texas Hill Country, and that he had witnessed something, had been a witness to a crime committed by men who were considerably more powerful than a 24-year-old ranch hand with no money and no connections, and that the men who had committed that crime had made very clear that witnesses were not a situation they intended to allow to persist. He had run. He was not proud of it, he said, though she heard something more complicated than shame in the way he said it. He had run, and he had built himself a different name and a different life in a different territory, and for 8 years it had held. But the men in redemption were not lawmen. They were the other kind. They were the kind sent to close accounts. He said he would handle it. He said he was not the same man who had run 8 years ago, and he was not going to run again. He said she should take no action and think nothing of it, and he was sorry to have burdened her with it. She had stopped walking and turned to face him fully, and said that she was not burdened, and that handling it alone was not the only available option, and that Sheriff Meade should know immediately so that this could be addressed with the full weight of the law behind it. He said he wasn't sure the law was going to be enthusiastic about protecting a man who had been living under a false name for 8 years. She said that what he had been doing was surviving, not committing a crime, and that whoever had sent those men from Texas had more to answer for than he did. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she became aware of the sound of the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods and a hawk calling somewhere above them. And then he said her name. Just her name, Inez, in a tone she had never heard from him before, a tone that had no neutrality in it at all, and her heart did something she didn't have a word for. She said, "Tell me what you need me to do." What he needed, it turned out, was more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Sheriff Aldous Meade, when told a carefully edited version of the situation by Charles that evening, was not unsympathetic. Aldous Meade was a broad, weary man of 60 who had been in law enforcement in one form or another since before Charles had been born, and he had a pragmatist's view of what the law was designed to protect and what it sometimes needed to be protected from. He listened to Charles's account without interrupting, asked 3 precise questions, and then sat back in his chair and said that what they were dealing with was almost certainly connected to a name Inez did not recognize, but that made Charles go very still. The name of a man called Donovan Hale, who had extensive interests in the Texas cattle industry, and who had, according to the kind of rumors that circulated among lawmen if not in newspapers, a habit of solving problems with permanent solutions. Hale was not someone Sheriff Meade could simply wire a warrant for. Hale had friends in places that made warrants complicated. What Hale had sent north were 2 men named, as Charles knew from having made careful inquiries of a contact in Santa Fe, Reeves, and Caulfield, both of whom had the kind of records that stayed off records, and who were known in the territory for what was politely termed collection work. The question, Meade said, was not whether to deal with them. The question was how, and specifically how to do it in a way that didn't end with Charles Garrett or Reardon or whatever name the man wanted to use, face down in the street. It was Inez who suggested the solution, and she suggested it after a sleepless night in which she had lain in her small house and thought through the problem with the same methodical rigor she brought to anything that required solving. She came to the sheriff's office at first light with a plan. She knew, because she had made it her business to know the territory and its connections as thoroughly as she knew her multiplication tables, that a federal land surveyor named Grant Wicks had arrived in the area the week before, tasked with the federal government's ongoing interest in disputed land boundaries in the valley. She knew that federal presence complicated Hale's ability to operate quietly. She also knew that Wicks had mentioned, in the casual conversation she'd drawn out of him at Baum's store, that he had an ongoing correspondence with a particular federal judge in Santa Fe named Harlow who had been, in Wicks' words, vigorously interested in certain cattle industry irregularities in the Texas territories for some time. She laid this out for Meade and Charles in the morning light, sitting across from them with her hands folded on the desk and her voice steady, and she watched Charles watch her with an expression she could not quite read, something between astonishment and something softer, something she was afraid to name because she needed to stay focused. Meade said it was a fine idea, but that the wire to Santa Fe would take days, and that in those days Reeves and Caulfield were unlikely to sit comfortably in the boarding house waiting for federal intervention. Charles said that he could talk to them directly. Inez said that was not happening. He looked at her again with that unreadable expression, and she said, as calmly as she could manage, that walking into a meeting with two men sent specifically to kill you was not handling the situation. It was the situation. He said he was not without experience in managing dangerous men. She said she was sure that was true, and it was entirely beside the point. The argument might have gone on in that register for some time, except that Heinrich Baum's wife, whose name was Ussold, and who had her own particular intelligence-gathering network built from years of being underestimated, and therefore invisible to conversations that would have gone quiet if anyone had realized she was paying attention, came to the office that afternoon with information that changed the calculation entirely. Reeves and Caulfield were not planning to stay in Redemption. They were planning to make their move that night, before Reeves's leg, which he had injured on the hard ride north, got any worse. And they were not, Ussold reported with the flat certainty of someone who had heard this directly through the thin wall of the boarding house room adjacent to theirs, planning a conventional approach. They had learned that Charles was the deputy sheriff, and they were going to take care of that complication first, which meant that the sheriff's office itself was the target. What happened next moved quickly. Meade sent his one other deputy, a young man named Torres, to ride for the federal surveyor's camp with a written message for Wicks. He arranged for Charles to be visibly elsewhere, which was the only part of the plan Charles objected to strenuously, on the grounds that he was not in the habit of letting other people absorb risks on his behalf, and which Inez resolved by pointing out that the alternative was to give Reeves and Caulfield exactly what they'd ridden all this way for, and asking him if his pride was worth more to him than the lives of everyone else in the building. He had looked at her then with something that was not quite anger and not quite anguish, something caught between the two, and he had said, very quietly, that she was the most infuriating woman he had ever encountered. She had said she took that as an indication she was doing something right. That night, Reeves and Caulfield approached the sheriff's office and were met not by Charles, but by Sheriff Meade and Torres, and two additional men Meade had quietly enlisted from among the town's more reliable citizens, all of them positioned with a thoroughness that left Reeves and Caulfield no direction in which their options looked encouraging. There was a brief, tense confrontation in which shots were not fired, which was fortunate, and Reeves and Caulfield made the pragmatic calculation that 2 against 4 plus the law, in a town that was clearly prepared for them, was not the mathematics of a successful outcome. They were disarmed and held, and Wicks arrived in the morning and the wire went south, and by the time the dust had settled 3 days later, a federal warrant had been issued that reached considerably further than Reeves and Caulfield and began the slow, grinding process of reaching for Donovan Hale himself. It took 8 months for that process to conclude. 8 months during which Charles existed in a particular limbo, suspended between his old name and his new one, between the past he'd run from and the life he'd built, waiting to find out whether Hale's reach extended far enough to make even a federal warrant a temporary inconvenience. During those 8 months, something happened between Inez and Charles that neither of them planned and both of them were, in different ways, helpless against. It did not happen all at once. It happened in the way that things that have been building for a long time happen when the circumstances stop making restraint feel necessary. Gradually, and then completely. It started with the evenings he began spending at her house, ostensibly to discuss the ongoing situation with Hale, which required periodic updates and strategic thinking, but which evolved with an inevitability that neither of them acknowledged into something that had nothing to do with strategy. They would talk about Hale and the territory and the progress of the federal case, and then they would talk about other things, and then they would talk about themselves, carefully at first, and then with an honesty that surprised them both, the kind of honesty that comes from having already seen each other clearly in a crisis, and finding that what was seen was not cause for retreat. Charles told her about his family. His father, who had worked himself into an early grave building something that Hale's men had dismantled in an afternoon when a land dispute went the wrong way. His older brother, who had been in the house when Hale's men came, who had not survived it. He told her without sentimentality or self-pity, in the flat, careful voice of a man who has rehearsed the truth, until it sits correctly in his mouth, and she listened without offering comfort he hadn't asked for, because she understood that what he needed was not comfort but to be heard, and she gave him that with a complete, unwavering attention that he told her later was the most generous thing anyone had ever given him. She told him about her father. The charm and the intelligence and the way a room reorganized itself around his moods, everyone subtly tuning their behavior to the barometric pressure of his presence, and growing up as the one who was most attuned to that pressure, who had become so skilled at reading and managing, and preemptively smoothing that by the time she was 20, she had almost no idea what she actually wanted as distinct from what the people around her needed from her. She told him about the engagement she'd broken, not because the man had been cruel, but because she'd understood, too late but not too late, that she was marrying a version of her father in different clothing, and that understanding had arrived with the force of a physical shock, the recognition that she had been on the verge of walking willingly back into the cage she'd spent 26 years learning to recognize. She told him she'd come to redemption to find out who she was when she wasn't performing the version of herself that other people required. He listened. He asked questions. He did not offer reassurance or redirect. He simply received what she was telling him as if it was significant, which it was, and important, which it was, and entirely worthy of his full attention, which it was. By the time November came, Inez had stopped pretending that what she felt for Charles Garrett was anything other than what it was. She had sat with herself honestly and examined the feeling from every angle she could construct, looking for the familiar shape of the old patterns, the comfort-seeking dressed as love, the attraction to unavailability dressed as respect, the performance of being needed dressed as partnership. She found none of it. What she found instead was something she didn't have much prior experience with, something clean and grounded and specific to him and to who she had become, a love that asked nothing from her except that she be exactly who she was and offer it the same honesty she offered everything else. She didn't tell him, not yet. She was waiting for something, though she couldn't have said precisely what, some alignment of circumstances or courage or both. She was patient. She had learned patience the hard way, and it was one of the things she was actually good at. What she did not anticipate was that Charles, who had been doing his own interior accounting with the same painstaking thoroughness, would arrive at his own moment of clarity first, and that his particular form of action on that clarity would be so quiet and so entirely him that she would almost miss it. It was Heinrich Baum's winter celebration, held in the main room of the general store in December, The kind of gathering that a frontier town puts together when it needs to remember it has something worth celebrating. Everyone came. The store was lit with lanterns, and there was food brought by every household, and someone had managed a fiddle, and the children ran underfoot in their excitement. And Inez had worn her best dress, a dark blue wool, and had her hair up in a way that had taken longer than she planned. And when she arrived and found Charles already there, standing near the stove with a cup of something hot in his hand, and talking to old Reverend Pritchett. And he had looked across the room at her with an expression that stopped her feet for a moment, because it was unguarded in a way she'd never quite seen from him, something almost startled in it, as if seeing her had been unexpected even though he had known. She'd be there, she thought. Now, this is what I was waiting for. They had talked all evening. Not privately, not in any way that would have given the town something to discuss, but with a closeness that had its own privacy despite the crowd, their voices low and their conversation turning in and out of the easy territory they'd always shared and into something newer and warmer. He'd brought her another cup of cider without asking. She'd laughed at something he'd said with a fullness that surprised her. The fiddle had struck up and several couples had moved the tables back and danced, and Charles had looked at her and said that he wasn't much for dancing, but that he'd be glad to try making a fool of himself if she was interested, and she had laughed again and said she'd be delighted. He had not made a fool of himself. He danced the way he did most things, with a quiet, unhurried competence that didn't call attention to itself, and she had fit against him in the particular way that you fit against someone when the dimensions are simply right. And the warmth of the store and the noise of the celebration and the lantern light on his face when he looked down at her had conspired to make the moment feel like something she'd been moving toward for a long time without knowing it was waiting. When it was over and the crowd began to thin and the night had turned deeply cold, he'd walked her home, which he'd done before, but tonight he'd stopped on her porch, and instead of the usual good night with its careful, held-back quality, he had said her name and she'd turned, and he'd said, with the same directness she'd been trying to give herself permission to use with him for months, "Inez, I have been trying to find the right time to say something to you, and I've concluded that there isn't a right time, there's only the willingness to say it." He'd stopped. She'd waited. He said, "I love you." He said it simply, without decoration, the way a man says the truest thing he knows. "I have loved you for a considerable amount of time. I thought you should know." She had reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the one with the scar, and said, "I know, and I love you." She'd known for almost a year. She was sorry she'd made him go first. He'd laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and the sound of it in the cold dark of the porch with the stars overhead in their thick winter array had been one of the most beautiful things she'd heard. And then he'd kissed her, and the world reorganized itself around the fact of it, and she had thought very clearly, there it is. Finally. The winter they spent together was the best of her life. Not because it was easy, it wasn't. The Hale situation was still unresolved, and Charles was still living under a form of threat that none of them could entirely discount. But because of the specific, irreducible quality of being fully known by someone, and loved in the totality of that knowledge, they moved through it together with a naturalness that felt like something that had always been true and was only now being acknowledged. She spent evenings at his house and he at hers. They talked about everything, the school and the town and the territory and their respective pasts and the books they were both reading and what they wanted, which was a conversation neither of them had had with another person in a long time. He said he wanted to stay in Redemption, that it was the first place he'd lived since the hill country that felt like his. She said she felt the same. They talked, carefully and then openly, about a future. He asked her in February if she'd consider marrying him. He didn't kneel. He asked in the direct, quiet way he asked everything, standing in her kitchen while she was making coffee, and she had turned from the stove with the pot in her hand and looked at him and thought briefly about all the versions of herself that had existed before this moment and how far she'd come from all of them. And she had said yes. She would very much consider it. She'd in fact been waiting for the question, and he had crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and kissed her with the coffee pot still in her hand. And it had been awkward and perfect. The federal case against Donovan Hale resolved in March of 1882. The resolution was complicated, as things involving powerful men with extensive interest always are. But the heart of it was that Hale had miscalculated in sending Reeves and Caulfield to a territory where they'd been caught, and the federal interest that had been waiting for exactly this kind of tangible evidence was comprehensive in its conclusions. Hale faced charges that would occupy years of legal proceedings, and while the wheels of that justice would turn slowly, the immediate threat to Charles was formally lifted, acknowledged in writing from the Santa Fe federal court, and Meade read the wire aloud in the office while Torres and Inez and Charles listened. And when he finished, there was a moment of silence in which nothing needed to be said. Charles put his hand over Inez's where it rested on the desk, and she turned hers over and held it, and Meade pretended to be very occupied with refiling the wire. It should have been the ending of the difficult part. For 3 days, it felt like it was. Charles walked with a slightly different quality, as if something he'd been carrying at an angle for 8 years had finally been set down correctly. They made plans. They talked about a wedding date, a real one, specific and imminent, and about the house, his house which was larger than hers, and about whether she would continue teaching after they married, which she absolutely would, and he'd said good. The town needed her, and the way he said it had made her love him so specifically and so thoroughly that she'd had to look out the window for a moment to organize herself. Then on the 4th day, something happened that Charles didn't tell her about. She would find out later from Meade, who felt she deserved to know and who told her 3 days after Charles had gone. Someone had ridden in from the south, a man she'd never seen before, who had spoken to Charles alone and briefly at the stable, and ridden out again. After that conversation, Charles had been different in a way that Inez had noticed, and that he had deflected when she asked, saying only that there was a thing he needed to think through, and that he didn't want to burden her with it until he was certain. She had let it go, which she would berate herself for afterward, though she knew that letting people she loved have the dignity of their own thinking was not a flaw. It was a choice she'd made deliberately. She had trusted him. What Meade told her was this: the man who'd come south was not connected to Hale. He was connected to Charles's original life, to the hill country, to a set of circumstances Charles had thought concluded. There was a woman, a former neighbor's daughter, who had married a man after Charles left Texas, a man who had turned out to be dangerous in the specific way that men who are dangerous to women behind closed doors are dangerous, invisible to the world and devastating at home. This woman's name was Clara. She was not a love interest, had never been, but she was someone Charles had known since childhood and who had sent a message with the writer, a message that said she was in serious danger and that she had no one else to appeal to. Charles's dark past had reached forward and presented him with a forced choice. Go back to Texas, back to the place he'd fled, back into the range of whatever remained of Hale's influence and into genuine physical danger, to help a woman who had no other help, or stay in redemption with Inez, with his life, with everything he'd built, and let Clara bear the consequences of a situation he hadn't created, but that he was perhaps the only person positioned to address. He had left before dawn. He had taken his horse and his rifle and everything practical. He had left his greatcoat on the hook beside the door, the coat he wore in the coldest weather, the one Inez had mended twice, and that she associated with him so completely that seeing it anywhere other than on his body made her think of him, and he had hung it with the care of someone placing something precious in safekeeping, and he had not left a note. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew that if he wrote it down he would have to say things he didn't know how to put into a sentence without it sounding like goodbye, and he wasn't prepared to make it a goodbye in words. The coat was the only thing he could offer, Warmth, provision, the evidence that he'd thought of her in the moment of leaving. She knew. She sat with the coat in her hands for 1 hour. Then she was moving. She went to Meade first because information before action was a principle she was not abandoning even in the middle of the worst morning of her life. Meade told her what he knew, which was most of it. She listened with the focused stillness that was not passivity but preparation. She asked which road. She asked how long a head start. She asked what was in Texas that would have stopped him from bringing her or telling her. Meade said he thought Charles had made a calculation that Inez would either try to come with him, which he couldn't allow because of the danger, or that telling her would result in exactly what was currently happening, which was that she'd go anyway. Inez said that was correct on both counts, and that the way to have avoided it was to trust her to make her own assessment of the risk, which was information she now intended to store for future reference. Meade looked at her for a moment, and then said that he couldn't in good conscience sanction a woman riding into a dangerous situation in Texas. She said she wasn't asking for sanction. She was asking for a horse that was faster than the one she currently had access to, because Meade had 2 excellent animals in the back paddock and she knew it, and she would return it. Meade was quiet for a moment. Then he said that his bay had been rested 2 days and was the faster animal. She was out of redemption within the hour. She rode hard through the morning and into the afternoon, following the southern road with the certainty of someone who had taken Meade's information and translated it into the most likely route, the road that cut through the pass south of town and connected eventually to the trail into the Texas Panhandle. The country was opening up into the flat, far-seeing distances of the Southern Territory, the mountains receding behind her and the sky expanding overhead into its immense New Mexico blue, and she rode with the coat rolled behind her saddle, because she'd brought it without deciding to. It had been in her hands when she'd left the house, and she hadn't put it down. She found him late afternoon. Not because she tracked him in any expert frontier sense. She was a schoolteacher from Missouri, and her tracking abilities were limited, but because she knew him well enough to know where he would stop. And there was only one place between Redemption and the Texas line, where a man with a horse and a conscience and a habit of watching carefully would stop to think, which was the bluff above the river crossing that Charles had shown her once in the fall when they'd ridden out past the town boundary. The place where you could see 40 miles in any direction and feel the full scale of the world in a way that made particular kinds of thinking possible. He was sitting on his horse at the top of the bluff when she rode up. He heard her coming and turned, and when he saw that it was her, his expression went through 3 distinct phases in rapid succession: relief, alarm, and something that looked, despite everything, exactly like love. She pulled up beside him and they looked at each other, and she said, because she was going to lead with what was most important, "Don't ever do that to me again." He said, "Inez." She said, "I mean it, Charles. I mean it more than I've meant most things. You left me a coat with no note and disappeared before dawn, and I will not accept that as your method of dealing with things that affect both of us. Do you understand me?" he said, in a voice that had something in it she'd never heard before, something raw and undone. "I didn't know how to write down that I might not come back. I didn't know how to say it to you," she said, with all the fierceness of someone who has ridden 30 miles in the wrong direction on a borrowed horse. "Then you should have said it anyway, because the not saying it was worse. The coat on the hook with no note was worse. Do you understand what that felt like? Knowing without words, because you didn't give me words." He looked at her, and what was in his face now was beyond what she had words for, something broken open and honest in a way she had never seen from anyone before, and he said, "I'm sorry. I am deeply sorry. I thought I was protecting you." She said, "I'm not something that needs protecting from information. And I'm not something you leave behind." He said, "I know that. I have always known that. I was afraid." It was the first time she had heard him use that word about himself. She let it sit between them for a moment, let it have its full weight, and then she said, more quietly, "Of what?" He said, "Of being the reason something happened to you. Of being the thing that brought danger to you." I have spent 8 years being the reason for danger, and I couldn't stand the thought of it being you who he stopped. She waited. He said, I love you too much to watch something happen to you. She said, and she felt the firmness of it in her bones. Then let me carry my own risks. Let me stand next to you. He looked at her for a long time. The wind was coming up from the south, warm for the season, and the light was turning gold at the edges, and the bay horse was patient and still beneath her, and somewhere far below the river moved over its rocks, and the silence of the territory expanded in every direction. He said, Clara is in Presidio, 2 days south. She sent word that her husband has threatened her with a severity that leaves no ambiguity. I know a man there, an old contact from my Texas years, a former sheriff named Briggs who has actual standing to intervene, but he needed to be reached and given information that only I could give him about the husband's history, about what he is. Inez took this in. She said, and you thought this required disappearing before dawn. He said, I thought it required speed, and I thought you would try to come. She said, I did try to come. Here I am. He looked at her with the expression she had been seeing from him in different registers for 2 years, the watching expression, only now it was stripped of its careful neutrality and was simply what it had always been underneath. Complete attention, complete feeling, complete recognition of who she was. He said, here you are. She said, let's go to Presidio, together. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, which he held for a moment without saying anything, and then he said, together. They rode south as the light failed. They made camp at the river crossing when the dark became impractical for travel, a camp that was modest and efficient, a fire because the night turned cold, and because a fire was not a danger out here where no one was specifically looking for them. And they sat close to it and talked through the plan, which Inez refined in the straightforward way she refined anything, by asking precise questions about what information Briggs would need, what legal standing existed for the intervention, what Clara's situation was in terms of mobility and willingness to leave. Charles answered her questions with the same precision, and somewhere in the middle of it she looked at him across the fire, this man she loved beyond her ability to properly articulate, and thought about the coat on the hook, and about what it had cost him to leave it, about the love in that gesture that had been trying to speak without words, and she felt something shift in her understanding of it that was not forgiveness, because there was nothing to forgive, but something like a deeper comprehension of the complicated, imperfect, fiercely felt nature of what they were to each other. She said, the coat. He looked at her across the fire. She said, you left it warm. You just taken it off. You didn't hang it there because you were finished with it. You hung it there because you wanted me to have something of you. He said quietly, yes. She said, that was not nothing, Charles. I want you to know that I understood what you were doing. And I want you to know that I would have rather had you stay and tell me. He said, I know. I understand that now. Or I understood it always, but the fear was louder than the understanding this time. She said, the fear won't be louder than the understanding again. It was not a question. He received it as the statement it was and nodded. They reached Presidio late the following afternoon, a border town that sat on the Rio Grande and had the dry, permanent intensity of a place that had been contested for so long it had simply become the contestation. Charles had been right that he knew the territory here. He moved through it with an ease that was different from his redemption ease, older and more guarded, and Inez stayed close and watched everything with the thorough attention she was capable of. Briggs, the former sheriff, was a short, solid man of about 50, with a face like a piece of territory that had seen considerable weather, who received Charles with a warmth that surprised Inez, until she understood that Briggs had been, 8 years ago, one of the few people in Texas who had believed Charles, and had been unable to help him in a way that had weighed on him since. The meeting in Briggs's home, which was small and cluttered with papers and books in a way Inez found immediately reassuring, was thorough and fast, Charles providing everything Briggs needed to know about the husband's history, a documented history of criminal behavior in 3 counties that Briggs, with his old networks, could access and present to the current sheriff as grounds for intervention. It took 2 days in Presidio. 2 days of waiting and strategizing, and the grinding tension of a situation in which someone was in danger, and the machinery of doing something about it was moving at its own pace, regardless of urgency. Inez occupied herself usefully, because occupation was her answer to anxiety, and she found in that time that Baum had been right, as Baum generally was, that the world looked different when you went toward the difficulty instead of around it. On the evening of the 2nd day, Briggs arrived at the boarding house where they were staying with news. The current sheriff, a younger man named Castellano, had accepted the documentation and moved on Clara and her husband, who had resisted in a manner that demonstrated exactly the threat he'd been posing. Clara was safe. She was with a sister in Presidio already, having been moved that morning before the confrontation, and the husband was in custody with charges that would hold. Charles sat down when he heard this, heavily, like a man who has been holding himself very upright for a long time and has now been given permission to stop. Inez sat beside him and took his hand and held it and said nothing, because nothing was what was needed. They stayed one more night in Presidio. Inez went to see Clara briefly in the morning, because she was curious in the specific way of someone who needs to see with her own eyes that a thing is true and good. Clara was a slight woman, dark-haired about their age, who had the manner of someone still recalibrating what it felt like not to be afraid, and she looked at Inez with an expression of surprised gratitude and said that Charles had said the woman he was going to marry was remarkable and that she was glad to know the word had not been applied carelessly. Inez said she was glad to meet her and glad she was safe. She meant both things. The ride back to Redemption took 2.5 days and was, in its way, one of the most important stretches of Inez's life, because it was the time when she and Charles said everything that had been left unsaid, the accumulated weight of 2 years of careful restraint, and 8 years of his secrets and 26 years of her own patterns, all of it laid out in the particular freedom that comes from moving through open country with no one else present. They talked for hours each day, the horses walking at an easy pace because there was no longer any urgency in the direction they were traveling, only intention. He told her everything about the hill country. She told him everything about Missouri. He told her about his brother whose name had been Patrick and what that loss had been, and she listened as she always listened, completely and without interruption. And when he was finished, she said that she was glad he'd survived it, and she said it in a way that meant exactly what it said, without the soft edges of consolation, and he received it the same way. She told him about the version of herself she'd been before Redemption, the girl who had been so skilled at managing and preempting and pleasing that she'd been almost invisible as a separate person. And he said that he found that impossible to imagine, which made her laugh. And she said that was the point of Redemption. That was what she'd gone there to build, the ability to be visible. He said that she was the most visible person he'd ever known, and that he meant it as a statement about her particular quality of presence, not its magnitude. She said she knew what he meant, and that it was one of the finer things anyone had ever said to her. They talked about the wedding. The specific, practical, imminent wedding that was going to happen in the spring, in the Redemption schoolhouse, which was Inez's place in the town and therefore the right place. He said he would wear his good coat. She said he should. She'd mended it twice already and it deserved to be shown off. He said she could also just wear his other coat, the warm one, any time she wanted, since it was hers anyway. He'd left it for her. She said that he had left it for her under circumstances she'd rather not repeat. He said he understood that completely. She said good. They arrived in Redemption on a Thursday afternoon in April to find that their absence had not gone unnoticed, as could have been predicted in a town of 300 people where everyone knew everyone's business, and that the combined relief and indignation of their neighbors was a complicated and entirely loving thing to navigate. Ussold Baum came out of the general store and looked at them both with the expression of a woman who has been very concerned, and is not going to reduce that concern to a simple statement of its cause, but who is going to make very good tea and sit with them until she is satisfied they are well. Meade returned Inez's borrowed horse without a word, which was its own form of communication. Torres waved from across the street with a broad grin. The spring wedding was everything Inez had not realized she wanted in a wedding, which was to say it was straightforward and warm and full of the people who constituted her life in redemption. The children from her school who had been given the day off, and attended in their best clothes with the seriousness of a civic occasion. Heinrich and Ussold Baum, Reverend Pritchett, who officiated with the brevity of a man who understood that the significant thing had already been established long before this moment. Meade and Torres and several ranching families who had become familiar in 2 years of living among them. She wore blue. Not the dark blue wool dress, but a lighter blue she'd ordered from Santa Fe 3 weeks before. Cotton with small white flowers, practical for the season, but with a quality that recognized the occasion. He wore his good coat over his best shirt, which was not a coat she'd mended but the better one. And when he turned to watch her come down the aisle of the schoolhouse, between the rows of chairs that the children had set up that morning, his expression was the unguarded one she had first seen at Heinrich Baum's winter celebration, the one that had no neutrality in it at all. The ceremony was brief, and the celebration afterward was long and included the fiddle again and dancing. And Charles danced with more confidence this time because he'd been practicing, which she'd known about, and which had made her love him with a specific tenderness she still didn't have a word for. They were married on April 28, 1882, which was a fine spring day in the New Mexico territory with a blue sky and a wind from the west, and the smell of blossoms from the handful of apple trees that someone had planted behind the schoolhouse, in a burst of optimism that the trees had proceeded to honor. Life after the wedding had a texture that Inez had not entirely anticipated, which was a texture of genuine happiness, and which required some adjustment because it was not a state she had extensive practice with. Not the happiness itself, she'd had moments of happiness, but the sustained, daily, practical version of it, the happiness that is woven into ordinary mornings and unremarkable evenings, and the small, specific pleasures of sharing a life with a person who is entirely themselves and who allows you to be entirely yourself. Charles continued as deputy sheriff through the summer. He was offered the sheriff's position in July when Aldous Meade announced his retirement, a retirement Meade had been postponing for 3 years, and took the night to think it over before accepting, which Inez observed was approximately 12 hours more deliberation than the situation required, because she had known from the moment Meade had made the offer that Charles would take it and that he should. She continued to teach. The school enrollment grew as the town grew, new families arriving through the summer and fall, and she submitted a request to the Territorial Board of Education for a second teacher to share the load of the expanded enrollment, a request that she pursued with the same methodical determination she brought to any institutional process, and that was granted in December of 1882, a victory she celebrated with considerable private satisfaction. In November, she told Charles she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd asked her to marry him, because the kitchen seemed to be where the important things happened between them, and his face did something she had never seen before, a kind of stunned, illuminated surprise that moved into a joy so complete it left him briefly without words. He crossed the kitchen and held her with the gentleness of someone holding something enormously precious, and she laughed into his shoulder and said she was not fragile, and he said he knew that. He knew that better than anything. He was simply very, very glad. Their son, James, named for no one but himself, was born in the summer of 1883, A healthy, forceful child with Charles's gray eyes and Inez's determination, which combination led Charles to remark, on approximately James's third day of life, that the world would need to brace itself. Inez said she thought that was exactly right and that she was very proud. The Hale case concluded in the fall of 1883, a lengthy legal proceeding that had required Charles to provide testimony in absentia through sworn affidavits, a process that Inez had helped him through with the same organized thoroughness she brought to paperwork of any kind. Hale was convicted on multiple charges and received a sentence that would keep him occupied for the remainder of his productive years. Charles read the wire that reported this outcome and then set it on the table and sat with it for a while, and Inez sat across from him with James asleep in the cradle she'd placed near the stove, and she didn't rush the silence. He said, eventually, that it was over. Not just the legal case, but the whole thing, the weight of it that he'd been carrying since the day he'd changed his name and ridden north. He said he felt lighter in a way he hadn't been sure he'd ever feel. She said she was glad. She said he deserved to feel exactly that light. He looked at her with the full, unguarded warmth that had become familiar to her and said, "I was lucky to find redemption." She said, "We both were." He said, "I mean you, Inez." She said, "I know, I mean you too." James took his first steps in February of 1884, directly toward the wood stove in a manner that suggested inherited fearlessness combined with insufficient situational awareness. And Charles caught him with the ease of a man who had been watching for exactly that development. And Inez looked at the two of them, her husband crouching on the floor with their son standing triumphant between his hands, and felt the specific, accumulated weight of every choice she'd made that had led to this room and this light and these people, and found that the weight was the good kind, the kind that meant substance and permanence, and everything that was the opposite of the cage. In the spring of 1884, Ussold Baum appeared at the door of the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon after the children had gone and sat down across from Inez and said, with the directness that was her particular form of warmth, that there was something she needed to tell her. She had been corresponding with her cousins in the Mescalero territory about a situation she'd become aware of, concerning a group of Apache families who had been displaced from land they'd held for generations by a combination of federal policy and private land speculation that was ongoing and deeply unjust. She was not asking Inez to fix an unfixable situation, she said. She was asking if Inez, as a teacher with connections to the Territorial Education Board, might be willing to advocate specifically for the education access of those children who'd been displaced and were now living in a situation that left them entirely outside any formal provision. Inez said yes before Ussold had finished the sentence, and then said she'd like to hear everything, and they had sat in the schoolhouse for 2 hours while Ussold told her, and Inez took notes in the precise, close hand she'd developed over years of managing a classroom, and by the end she had a plan that she brought to Charles that evening. Charles heard her out with the complete attention he always gave her. He said that as sheriff his jurisdiction was the town of Redemption and its immediate vicinity, but that he had contacts who had contacts in the territorial administration, and he would use every one of them. He did. The process was slow and imperfect, and the outcome was partial, as outcomes to systemic injustices generally are, but the school access was established for 12 children in the following year, and Inez taught 4 of them herself in the Redemption School, and she considered that imperfect partial victory one of the things she was most proud of in her entire professional life. The second child arrived in the fall of 1884, a girl this time, which Charles announced to the town with the exact same quality of stunned, illuminated joy with which he'd announced James, because it turned out that his capacity for that particular response was not finite but renewed itself with each occasion. They named her Alina, for no family connection, but because the name had the quality they both recognized as right when they said it. Alina was different from James in temperament in every observable way, quiet and watchful and deeply interested in what was happening around her. And from the first months of her life, Inez saw in her the particular quality of a child who would take the world seriously. And she felt a tenderness for that quality that was its own specific thing, distinct from the fierce, propulsive tenderness she felt for James. The town of Redemption had grown, by the end of 1884, from 300 residents to closer to 500, a growth that was bringing complications along with its expansions, new tensions between established families and newcomers, between different communities with different claims on the same resources, between the town's optimistic name and the difficulty of living up to it. Charles managed these tensions with the same quiet, thorough competence he'd always brought to the work, and Inez observed that he was better at it than anyone else she could imagine in the role, not because he was harder than other men, but because he was more honest, because he would say a difficult thing directly and trust that the people hearing it could bear it. She said this to him once, specifically, that she thought his particular quality of honesty was his most significant professional asset, and he'd said that he'd learned it from watching her, which she dismissed as generous excess. And he'd said no. He meant it precisely, that she had shown him by example what it looked like to say the true thing in the true way, and that he'd been doing his best to practice it for 4 years. She hadn't known what to do with that, so she'd kissed him instead, which he'd received without complaint. In the spring of 1885, on an April morning with a sky the color of the finest blue she had ever seen, Inez stood at the door of the schoolhouse and watched James, who was nearly 2 and experimenting extensively with running, chase a cat across the yard with a seriousness of purpose that was entirely his own. Charles had stopped by on his way to the office, which he did most mornings, the route taking him past the schoolhouse in a way that she knew was not strictly the most direct path to the sheriff's office, and that she had never mentioned. He stood beside her in the door and watched their son and the cat in the April morning, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the warmth of it was the ordinary kind, the best kind, the kind you can trust because it's not spectacular, it's simply there. She thought about the coat on the hook. She thought about it sometimes still, not with the sharp edge of that first morning, but with the fullness of having lived all the way through what it had meant and out the other side. He had left her his warmest coat on a hook with no note, and she had known, and knowing had sent her riding 30 miles south on a borrowed horse, and that had sent them both through everything else that followed, and everything that followed had made the life she was standing in. He felt her thinking. He had that ability, or perhaps she was simply not subtle about it. He looked down at her and said, "What are you thinking about?" she said. "A coat on a hook." He was quiet for a moment and she felt him understand. He said, "I'm sorry for that morning," she said. "I know you are. I know what the coat meant and I know what it cost you to go. I just don't want you to have to be that alone with things anymore." He said, "I'm not. I haven't been, not since you came south on Meade's horse. I think about that sometimes, you riding south on a borrowed horse to find me because I didn't have the sense to take you with me." She said, "You had the sense. You were afraid." He said, "I was afraid. And then you came and the fear didn't matter anymore, and I understood that you were not something I needed to protect from my life. You were the person I was supposed to live it with." She said, "That's exactly right." James caught the cat, which protested with dignity, and he held it with an expression of complete triumph and looked back at them for confirmation of his achievement. And Charles laughed, which was the real laugh, the one she'd first heard on the porch the night he'd told her he loved her, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her life finding reasons to hear that laugh, because it was the truest thing about him, the version of him that trusted the world enough to be delighted by it. The years that followed laid themselves down in the particular way of years that are fully lived, not smoothly, not without difficulty, because the territory was still the territory, and the town was still a place where people brought all their human complications, but with the essential quality of two people who had found each other honestly and held on with the specific, daily determination that genuine love requires. Charles served as sheriff of redemption for 11 years total, a tenure that became a point of civic pride in the way that consistent, unglamorous competence eventually becomes its own kind of legend. He was known for being fair and for being honest, and for the way he managed to be both without losing either. He was known, in the way that things are known in a small town, for walking past the schoolhouse most mornings and stopping to speak to his wife, who could be observed through the window managing 17 children with a quality of organized warmth that produced, year after year, children who could read and calculate and reason, and who left redemption for wider worlds better equipped than they'd arrived. James grew into his fearlessness with the addition of considerable judgment, which Inez attributed to influence and Charles attributed to character, and both of them were probably right. Elena grew into her watchfulness and seriousness, and turned out to have a particular gift for mathematics that delighted Inez on a professional level, and on a personal level, brought back memories of her own childhood relationship with numbers as the one domain where things were simply and reliably true. A third child arrived in 1887, a son they named Thomas, who was the most cheerful person Inez had ever encountered in her life, an assessment she applied without qualification from approximately his 6th month onward, because Thomas found the world continuously and specifically delightful, and communicated this impression with a constancy that made every room he entered a slightly better room. She was teaching still at 33, and then at 35, teaching with the full weight of everything she knew about who she was and what she was doing and why it mattered, and the children in her classroom were the continuing evidence that she had been right to come to redemption, right to stay, right to build exactly this life in exactly this place. Charles, at 42, had the quality of a man who has done the work of becoming himself and arrived at a genuine satisfaction with the result, not complacency, but the solid, unglamorous peace of someone who has earned his life and knows it, and is not inclined to spend his time wishing it were otherwise. He had also, in the years since his name had been formally and legally restored through the patient work of Santa Fe lawyers, that Inez had essentially arranged over a period of 8 months of correspondence, been simply and completely Charles Garrett, a name that was both what he was called and what he was, and the coherence of that had done something important and permanent to the quality of his presence. He still wore the coat. The greatcoat that he'd left on the hook that April morning in 1882 had been hung back on its hook when they'd returned from Presidio, and it had been worn every winter since, and it had been mended and maintained with the care that good things deserve, and it hung now on the hook beside the door of their home, which was the house they'd expanded twice as the family grew, the hook that was the first thing you saw when you came in from the cold, and the sight of it there had become, for Inez, a marker of everything that had resolved itself from the worst morning of her life into the life she had, which was the best life she could imagine. On a winter evening in 1888, James sitting at the table with a book, Elena beside him working at a problem in her notebook, Thomas asleep in the room they'd built for the children, Charles coming in from the cold with snow on his shoulders and the coat's collar turned up and his face ruddy from the weather. Inez looked at her family from where she stood by the stove and felt the fullness of it press against her chest with a weight she recognized as gratitude, the specific, dense gratitude of someone who knows the precise shape of the alternative. Charles came to her across the kitchen, as he had in every iteration of that kitchen over the years, and kissed her with the easy, settled warmth of a man who has been kissing this woman for 6 years, and expects to do so for 60 more. She reached up and brushed the snow from his collar, which she'd done 100 times, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that she still found as readable as they were on the day she'd understood what he felt for her, those eyes that were never quite neutral, always watching and always feeling, and he said, "Good evening." She said, "Good evening." He said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "Everything we've built." He looked around the room. James looked up from his book and said something to his father that Charles answered with a brief, warm exchange that had the ease of their particular relationship, direct and fond. Alina didn't look up from her notebook, which was also entirely characteristic. The stove ticked with the heat. He looked back at her. He said, "It's more than I thought I'd have," she said. "I know. Me too," he said. "I should have told you instead of leaving you a coat with no note," she said. "You should have. And then you came back and we talked, and I came south on Meade's horse and here we are." He said, "Here we are." She took his hand and held it the way she had held it in the sheriff's office in Presidio, completely and without reservation, and the fire in the stove and the children at the table, and the snow against the window and the coat on its hook, and the years of everything they'd built together settled around them like the warmest thing she knew. She had known, that April morning, when she'd pressed her palm to his coat and found it warm. She had known what his silence meant and what his coat meant and what the hook with no note meant, and knowing had been the beginning of everything, the thing that had sent her toward instead of away, the first step in the direction of the life that was now entirely hers. She was grateful for the knowing. She was grateful for the coat. She was grateful, in the large and specific and daily and particular way that she was grateful for the things that mattered most, for Charles Garrett, who had hung it there for her, who had thought of her warmth in the moment of his leaving, who had loved her in the only way he knew how in that moment before he learned better, which was quietly and completely and without adequate words. She would spend the rest of her life giving him better words. And he would spend the rest of his giving her reasons to need them. And between them they would make something that was not a story of rescue or arrival, but of two people who had each survived their separate damages and chosen each other with full knowledge, which was the only kind of choosing that made a love that lasted. Outside the window, the snow fell on Redemption, which had grown into a town that almost lived up to its name, and the territory stretched in every direction under the winter sky, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And inside the house on the main road with the expanded rooms and the children at the table, Inez Townsend Garrett stood beside her husband and felt the warmth that had nothing to do with coats, the warmth that was the specific, irreplaceable heat of a life that is exactly what it ought to be. Built by intention and sustained by choice every single day.